Hello. I am having a bad day, so I thought I would force myself to read more of this. This is called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Kolk. If you haven't seen my part 1 of this, I highly recommend watching that video, as you will be completely lost as to what I'm reading about, because now I'm going to continue the first chapter. In my first video, I read the prologue and the first part of chapter 1 in part 1 of the book. So there is so much more to go in this book. I only made it to page 12 when I read last, so let's see how far I can get today. As I will do in every one of these videos, I will put a massive trigger warning here. I do not recommend watching this if you are sensitive to any type of traumatic experiences or hearing about them. Yeah, I strongly advise clicking off this video if you're in a sensitive state of any kind and can't handle hearing about this stuff. Otherwise, I think it's very important to learn about this, as the only way that I have been able to start getting better is by learning about it. If the people around me had started learning about it much earlier on in my life, meaning as a child, then I would not have ended up nearly as bad struggling with PTSD as I do now. So yeah, it's very important. Please share this video, please share the series, and I will continue it. Subscribe if you want to see me when I come out with more. Okay. Where we left off was with him talking about Tom and his fellow veterans, if you remember. This next part is called Trauma and the Loss of Self. The first study I did at the VA started with systematically asking veterans what had happened to them in Vietnam. I wanted to know what had pushed them over the brink, and why some had broken down as a result of that experience while others had been able to go on with their lives. That's one major thing about this too, is that a lot of people will invalidate others because they went through the same thing and they're not as affected. Their brain didn't break from PTSD, so how come you're still complaining about it 20 years later? Everybody's brain is different. If you don't understand that, then you're a freaking idiot. And if you're putting people down because they're different from you, you got some own problems you need to deal with, buddy. Gosh. Most of the men I interviewed had gone to war feeling well prepared, drawn close by the rigors of basic training and the shared danger. They exchanged pictures of their families and girlfriends. They put up with one another's flaws. And then they were prepared to risk their lives for their friends. Most of them confided their dark secrets to a buddy, and some went so far as to share each other's shirts and socks. Many of the men had friendships similar to Tom's with Alex. Tom met Alex, an Italian guy from Malden, Massachusetts, on his first day in country, and they instantly became close friends. They drove their Jeep together, listened to the same music, and read each other's letters from home. They got drunk together and chased the Vietnamese bar girls. This is one thing that disgusts me about men who go to war. It's like a joke to them to cheat on their wives. How is that possibly the most triggering thing I'll read all day is that, oh yeah, we read our letters from our wives at home and then at night went to go chase the Vietnamese bar girls. Screw you. Just screw you. After about 3 months in country, Tom led his squad on a foot patrol through a rice paddy just before sunset. Suddenly, a hail of gunfire spurted from the green wall of the surrounding jungle, hitting the men around him one by one. Tom told me how he had looked on in helpless horror as all of the members of his platoon were killed or wounded in a matter of seconds. He would never get one image out of his mind: the back of Alex's head as he lay face down in the rice paddy, his feet in the air. Tom wept as he recalled. He was the only real friend I ever had. Afterward, at night, Tom continued to hear the screams of his men and to see their bodies falling into the water. Any sounds, smells, or images that reminded him of the ambush, like the popping of firecrackers on the 4th of July, made him feel just as paralyzed, terrified, and enraged as he had the day the helicopter evacuated him from the rice paddy. Maybe even worse for Tom than the recurrent flashbacks of the ambush was the memory of what happened afterward. I could easily imagine how Tom's rage about his friend's death had led to the calamity that followed. Yeah, I remember reading this. Again, I'm gonna put a massive trigger warning here. It took him months of dealing with his paralyzing shame before he could tell me about it. Since time immemorial, veterans like Achilles in Homer's Iliad have responded to the death of their comrades with unspeakable acts of revenge. The day after the ambush, Tom went into a frenzy to a neighboring village, killing children, shooting an innocent farmer, and raping a Vietnamese woman. After that, it became truly impossible for him to go home again in any meaningful way. How can you face your sweetheart and tell her that you brutally a woman just like her? Or watch your son take his first step when you are reminded of the child you killed? Tom experienced the death of Alex as if part of himself had been forever destroyed, the part that was good and honorable and trustworthy. Trauma, whether it is the result of something done to you or something you yourself have done, almost always makes it difficult to engage in intimate relationships. After you have experienced something so unspeakable, how do you learn to trust yourself or anyone else again? Or conversely, how can you surrender to an intimate relationship after you have been brutally violated? Sorry guys, I'm having a really bad day. And also, I deeply connect with that. Tom kept showing up faithfully for his appointments, as I had become for him a lifeline, the father he'd never had, and Alex who had survived the ambush. It takes enormous trust and courage to allow yourself to remember. One of the hardest things for traumatized people is to confront their shame about the way they behaved during a traumatic episode, whether it is objectively warranted, as in the commission of atrocities, or not, as in the case of a child who tries to placate her abuser. Placate? One of the first people to write about this phenomenon was Sarah Haley, who occupied an office next to mine at the VA clinic, in an article entitled "When the Patient Reports Atrocities," which became a major impetus for the ultimate creation of the PTSD diagnosis. She discussed the well-nigh intolerable difficulty of talking about and listening to the horrendous acts that are often committed by soldiers in the course of their war experiences. It's hard enough to face the suffering that has been inflicted by others, but deep down, many traumatized people are even more haunted by the shame they feel about what they themselves did or did not do under the circumstances. They despise themselves for how terrified, dependent, excited, or enraged they felt. In later years, I encountered a similar phenomenon in victims of child abuse. I know it's like, you're probably like, why is she making herself reading this when she's not feeling good? Because this is the most important thing for me to learn about in order to help myself. And in case you didn't know, it is hard for me to read about certain things. I'm sure you can tell. It's because they're triggering. Oh wow, you ever wondered what the real definition of triggering is? It's people who have PTSD. It's not a joke, and I hate that it's so memed at this point in society. The real PTSD survivors don't like using it. That's how much the word triggered has become so memed. In later years, I encountered a similar phenomenon in victims of child abuse. Most of them suffer from agonizing shame about the actions they took to survive and maintain a connection with the person who abused them. This is particularly true if the abuser was someone close to the child, someone the child depended on, as is so often the case. The result can be confusion about whether one was a victim or a willing participant, which in turn leads to bewilderment about the difference between love and terror, pain and pleasure. We will return to this dilemma throughout this book. That explains and helps explain why often trauma survivors continue to get themselves into abusive relationships. Because you don't understand what love is, because you never had it. You didn't get the consequential love you needed as a child from the people you should have and you should have been able to trust. So therefore, you don't know how to look for healthy, loving relationships. You don't know you deserve that. You don't, quite frankly, know what you deserve, and if you'll ever get it. And it sucks. This next part of this chapter is called Numbing. Maybe the worst of Tom's symptoms was that he felt emotionally numb. He desperately wanted to love his family, but he just couldn't evoke any deep feelings for them. He felt emotionally distant from everybody, as though his heart was frozen and he were living behind a glass wall. I also wrote a poem that perfectly depicts that. Very interesting. Wow. Ooh, I just got goosebumps. The numbness extended to himself as well. He could not really feel anything except for his momentary rages and his shame. He described how he hardly recognized himself when he looked in the mirror to shave. When he heard himself arguing a case in court, he would observe himself from a distance and wonder how this guy, who happened to look and talk like him, was able to make such cogent arguments. This is disassociation, and it has already happened to me 3 times as I filmed this video. When he won a case, he pretended to be gratified, and when he lost, it was as though he had seen it coming and he was resigned to the defeat even before it happened. Despite the fact that he was a very effective lawyer, he always felt as though he were floating in space, lacking any sense of purpose or direction. It's kind of funny because in high school, I remember telling my friends, before I was diagnosed with PTSD, I told them that I felt like my head was always in the clouds. And I said it as if it was a good thing. I tried to see it as a good thing. It wasn't a good thing. The only thing that occasionally relieved this feeling of aimlessness was intense involvement in a particular case. Learned about myself too. If I intently put myself into something purposeful that I'm passionate about, I'm great. I'm doing great. So that's the key with PTSD, is you really just have to force yourself a lot of the time to focus on other things and to make yourself have a purpose. One thing that's helped me is realizing that if you take a PTSD survivor's purpose away from them, that is when they crash. If you give a PTSD survivor a purpose, that is when they soar. And that is one of the most important things I ever learned. During the course of our treatment, Tom had to defend a mobster on a murder charge. Okay, I know I keep stopping, I'm sorry. But this is one thing that made me realize what I just said. I focus on murder mystery stuff on YouTube. I watch Bailey Sarian, I watch Eleanor Niall, a couple of other ones. And I realized, by golly, watching stuff about murder and really, really graphic, horrifying stuff, that's totally fine with me because it takes me out of my own head and all of the traumatic stuff that my brain focuses on instead of what it should be focusing on, which is life. So if I'm focusing on a murder case, there's nothing else going on up there. So ironically enough, I cannot play horror games, and I hate TV shows about murder. It's so slow going and dramatic. But just listening to somebody tell a story about it, great for me. I could do it all day, sadly. It's not triggering for me unless they talk about specific things that I clearly can't even read about. But still, something very interesting to me. Focusing on horrible, traumatic stuff that didn't happen to you can be helpful to distract you from the terror that you feel thinking about what you normally think about, that you can't control. For the duration of that trial, he was totally absorbed in devising a strategy for winning the case, and there were many occasions on which he stayed up all night to immerse himself in something that actually excited him. It was like being in combat, he said. He felt fully alive, and nothing else mattered. The moment Tom won that case, however, he lost his energy and sense of purpose. The nightmares returned, as did his rage attacks, so intensely that he had to move into a motel to ensure that he would not harm his wife or children. But being alone, too, was terrifying, because the demons of the war returned in full force. Tom tried to stay busy, working, drinking, and drugging, doing anything to avoid confronting his demons. He kept thumbing through Soldier of Fortune, fantasizing about enlisting as a mercenary in one of the many regional wars then raging in Africa. That spring, he took out his Harley and roared up the Pancamagus Highway in New Hampshire. The vibrations, speed, and danger of that ride helped him pull himself back together, to the point that he was able to leave his motel room and return to his family. This next part is the reorganization of perception. Another study I conducted at the VA started out as research about nightmares, but ended up exploring how trauma changes people's perceptions and imagination. Bill, a former medic who had seen heavy action in Vietnam a decade earlier, was the first person enrolled in my nightmare study. After his discharge, he had enrolled in a theological seminary and had been assigned to his first parish in a congregational church in a Boston suburb. He was doing fine until he and his wife had their first child. Soon after the baby's birth, his wife, a nurse, had gone back to work while he remained at home, working on his weekly sermon and other parish duties and taking care of their newborn. On the very first day he was left alone with his baby, it began to cry, and he found himself suddenly flooded with unbearable images of dying children in Vietnam. Bill had to call his wife to take over childcare and came to the VA in a panic. He described how he kept hearing the sounds of babies crying and seeing images of burned and bloody children's faces. My medical colleagues thought that he must surely be psychotic because the textbooks at the time said that auditory and visual hallucinations were symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. The same texts that provided this diagnosis also supplied a cause. Bill's psychosis was probably triggered by his feeling displaced in his wife's affections by their new baby. This is one big reason why I will not shut up about PTSD and educating people about it. One of my many reasons is because if this were 30 years ago, I would be in a psych ward. I would have been given up on. I probably would be dead because it would have been so hard on me. And I can't imagine how many people did go through that. As I arrived at the intake office that day, I saw Bill surrounded by worried doctors who were preparing to inject him with a powerful antipsychotic drug and ship him off to a locked ward. They described his symptoms and asked my opinion. Having worked in a previous job on a ward specializing in the treatment of schizophrenics, I was intrigued. Something about the diagnosis didn't sound right. I asked Bill if I could talk with him, and after hearing his story, I'd unwittingly paraphrased something Sigmund Freud had said about trauma in 1895. I think this man is suffering from memories. I told Bill that I would try to help him, and after offering him some medications to control his panic, asked if he would be willing to come back a few days later to participate in a nightmare study. He agreed. As part of that study, we gave our participants a Rorschach test. Unlike tests that require answers to straightforward questions, responses to the Rorschach are almost impossible to fake. The Rorschach provides us with a unique way to observe how people construct a mental image from what is basically a meaningless stimulus, a blot of ink. Because humans are meaning-making creatures, we have a tendency to create some sort of image or story out of those ink blots, just as we do when we lie in a meadow on a beautiful summer day and see images in the clouds floating high above. What people make out of these blots can tell us a lot about how their minds work. I've never done one of these. I'd be interested to. On seeing the second card of the Rorschach test, Bill exclaimed in horror, "That is that child that I saw being blown up in Vietnam. In the middle, you see the charred flesh, the wounds, and the blood is spurting out all over." Panting and with sweat beading on his forehead, he was in a panic similar to the one that had initially brought him to the VA clinic. Although I had heard veterans describing their flashbacks, this was the first time I actually witnessed one. In that very moment in my office, Bill was obviously seeing the same images, smelling the same smells, and feeling the same physical sensations he had felt during the original event. 10 years after helplessly holding a dying baby in his arms, Bill was reliving the trauma in response to an ink blot. Experiencing Bill's flashback firsthand in my office helped me realize the agony that regularly visited the veterans I was trying to treat, and helped me appreciate how critical it was to find a solution. My neighbor's dog is barking, and they seem to just be letting him nowadays. Sorry if you hear it. The traumatic event itself, however horrendous, had a beginning, a middle, and an end, but now I saw that flashbacks could be even worse. You never know when you will be assaulted by them again, and you have no way of telling when they will stop. It took me years to learn how to effectively treat flashbacks, and in this process, Bill turned out to be one of the most important mentors. I'm very excited to see how this has helped. When we gave the Rorschach test to 21 additional veterans, the response was consistent. 16 of them, on seeing the second card, reacted as if they were experiencing a wartime trauma. The second Rorschach card is the first card that contains color and often elicits so-called color shock in response. The veterans interpreted this card with descriptions like, "These are the bowels of my friend Jim after a mortar shell ripped him open," and "This is the neck of my friend Danny after his head was blown off by a shell while we were eating lunch." None of them mentioned dancing monks, fluttering butterflies, men on motorcycles, or any of the other ordinary, sometimes whimsical images that most people see. While the majority of the veterans were greatly upset by what they saw, the reactions of the remaining 5 were even more alarming. They simply went blank. "This is nothing," one observed, "just a bunch of ink." They were right, of course, but the normal human response to ambiguous stimuli is to use our imagination to read something into them. We learned from these Rorschach tests that traumatized people have a tendency to superimpose their trauma on everything around them and have trouble deciphering whatever is going on around them. There appeared to be little in between. We also learned that trauma affects the imagination. The 5 men who saw nothing in the blots had lost the capacity to let their minds play. But so, too, had the other 16 men, for in viewing scenes from the past in those blots, they were not displaying the mental flexibility that is the hallmark of imagination. They simply kept replaying an old reel. Imagination is absolutely critical to the quality of our lives. Our imagination enables us to leave our routine, everyday existence by fantasizing about travel, food, sex, falling in love, or having the last word, all the things that make life interesting. Imagination gives us the opportunity to envision new possibilities. It is an essential launchpad for making our hopes come true. It fires our creativity, relieves our boredom, alleviates our pain, enhances our pleasure, and enriches our most intimate relationships. When people are compulsively and constantly pulled back into the past, to the last time they felt intense involvement and deep emotions, they suffer from a failure of imagination, a loss of the mental flexibility. Without imagination, there is no hope, no chance to envision a better future, no place to go, no goal to reach. The Rorschach tests also taught us that traumatized people look at the world in a fundamentally different way from other people. For most of us, a man coming down the street is just someone taking a walk. A rape victim, however, may see a person who is about to molest her and go into a panic. A stern school teacher may be an intimidating presence to an average kid, but for a child whose stepfather beats them up, she may represent a torturer and precipitate a rage attack or a terrified cowering in the corner. This next part is called Stuck in Trauma. Our clinic was inundated with veterans seeking psychiatric help. However, because of an acute shortage of qualified doctors, all we could do was put most of them on a waiting list, even as they continued brutalizing themselves and their families. We began seeing a sharp increase in arrests of veterans for violent offenses and drunken brawls, as well as an alarming number of suicides. I received permission to start a group for young Vietnam veterans to serve as a sort of holding tank until real therapy could start. At the opening session for a group of former Marines, the first man to speak flatly declared, "I do not want to talk about the war." I replied that the members could discuss anything they wanted. After half an hour of excruciating silence, one veteran finally started to talk about his helicopter crash. To my amazement, the rest immediately came to life, speaking with great intensity about their traumatic experiences. All of them returned the following week and the week after. In the group, they found resonance and meaning in what had previously been only sensations of terror and emptiness. They felt a renewed sense of the comradeship that had been so vital to their war experience. They insisted that I had to be part of their newfound unit and gave me a Marine captain's uniform for my birthday. In retrospect, that gesture revealed part of the problem. You were either in or out. You either belonged to the unit or you were nobody. After trauma, the world becomes sharply divided between those who know and those who don't. People who have not shared the traumatic experience cannot be trusted because they can't understand it. Sadly, this often includes spouses, children, and coworkers. I just realized the bags under my eyes are crazy. Later, I led another group, this time for veterans of Patton's Army, men now well into their 70s, all old enough to be my father. We met on Monday mornings at 8 o'clock. In Boston, winter snowstorms occasionally paralyzed the public transit system, but to my amazement, all of them showed up even during blizzards, some of them trudging several miles through the snow to reach the VA clinic. I have met some old men who are like Army Marine vets, and they are like this. It's adorable. They're like very pertinent and true to their word. For Christmas, they gave me a 1940s GI issue wristwatch. As had been the case with my group of Marines, I could not be their doctor unless they made me one of them. Moving as these experiences were, the limits of group therapy became clear when I urged the men to talk about the issues they confronted in their daily lives, their relationships with their wives, children, girlfriends, and family, dealing with their bosses and finding satisfaction in their work, their heavy use of alcohol. Their typical response was to balk and resist, and instead recount yet again how they had plunged a dagger through the heart of a German soldier in the Hurtgen forest, or how their helicopter had been shot down in the jungles of Vietnam. Whether the trauma had occurred 10 years in the past or more than 40, my patients could not bridge the gap between their wartime experiences and their current lives. Somehow, the very event that caused them so much pain had also become their sole source of meaning. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting their traumatic past. I'm almost done with this chapter, guys, so I'm going to finish it for you. Okay, so this next part is called Diagnosing Post-Traumatic Stress. In those early days at the VA, we labeled our veterans with all sorts of diagnoses: alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, mood disorder, even schizophrenia, and we tried every treatment in our textbooks. But for all our efforts, it became clear that we were actually accomplishing very little. The powerful drugs we prescribed often left the men in such a fog that they could barely function. I said this in part 1 of this series, that me personally, as a PTSD survivor, prescription medications didn't help, and they made me feel like I was losing who I was as a person. When we encouraged them to talk about the precise details of a traumatic event, we often inadvertently triggered a full-blown flashback, rather than helping them resolve the issue. Many of them dropped out of treatment because we were not only failing to help, but also sometimes making things worse. This is one thing that's interesting to me, because when I did therapy, like actual talk therapy with a therapist, now I'm doing a spiritual healer, and she's a life, death, and birth expert, and she talks me through my ketamine experiences, and it's amazing. But when I was doing like regular old therapy at a doctor's office, when I was first diagnosed, it seemed like it was not helping. And it seemed like whenever I left, it was just worse, because all I was doing was recounting my traumas to her and then leaving. And that was my whole life, was my traumas. So just talking about it didn't do anything but bring it more to the surface. I don't know. Therapy is helpful to some people, okay? But that type of therapy was not helpful for me. I need to definitely look into different types. A turning point arrived in 1980 when a group of Vietnam veterans, aided by the New York psychoanalysts Chaim Shatton and Robert J. Lifton, successfully lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to create a new diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which described a cluster of symptoms that was common, to a greater or lesser extent, to all of our veterans. Systematically identifying the symptoms and grouping them together into a disorder finally gave a name to the suffering of people who were overwhelmed by horror and helplessness. With the conceptual framework of PTSD in place, the stage was set for a radical change in our understanding of our patients. This eventually led to an explosion of research and attempts at finding effective treatments. Inspired by the possibilities presented by this new diagnosis, I proposed a study on the biology of traumatic memories to the VA. Did the memories of those suffering from PTSD differ from those of others? For most people, I have to say before they even go on, yes, completely different from normal people, and it sucks to feel so different from like the average person because of your memories. Why? Why, brain? Can I just straight up ask you why, brain? Why you had to be this way? Because you suck. Raven's brain. Okay, you suck. Anyway. For most people, the memory of an unpleasant event eventually fades, or is transformed into something more benign. But most of our patients were unable to make their past into a story that happened long ago. Again, your brain doesn't have a choice in this. It does it, and then you have to live with it. And everybody's brain is different, so not everybody is going to be affected the same way by trauma. It's as simple as that. Everybody's different. The opening line of the grant rejection read, "It has never been shown that PTSD is relevant to the mission of the Veterans Administration." This is how much they didn't care about mental health in the past. That's crazy, and it's still such a struggle for people to talk about their mental health, especially PTSD. It is not talked about, so I'm doing it. Since then, of course, the mission of the VA has become organized around the diagnosis of PTSD and brain injury. So it's funny how they said it's never been proven to be important or relevant, and yet now it's the sole existence of the VA clinic is to treat PTSD and brain injury, and considerable resources are dedicated to applying evidence-based treatments to traumatized war veterans. But at the time, things were different, and unwilling to keep working in an organization whose views of reality was so at odds with my own, I handed in my resignation. In 1982, I took a position at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, the Harvard Teaching Hospital, where I had trained to become a psychiatrist. This is one thing that I've learned, being such a sensitive person and such a passionate person about my beliefs. I will not work at a place where the view of reality was so at odds with my own. Yeah, I can't work at places where things are just too off kilter and I try to say something to help fix it and I'm looked down for that. Yeah, no. You should be looking to improve every single business that exists ever. Not be upset when your employees try to help you and tell you how you can better the company. So I've always stuck to my grounds. Maybe not always, but now as an adult, I have learned what I'm willing to deal with and what I'm not willing to deal with. And if you have bad morals or a bad work environment, I'm not dealing with it. I've dealt with enough in my life. Bye, Felicia. I love that Bessel did this, that he said, you guys literally are going to deny PTSD when I've witnessed so many people hurting from it. Yeah, no, I'm not working here anymore. Good on you, Bessel. My new responsibility was to teach a fledgling area of study, psychopharmacology, the administration of drugs to alleviate mental illness. Okay, and now we took a turn, Bessel. I do not approve of using drugs, specifically prescription medications, to help mental illness because my mom was on a severe psychoactive drug for my entire life, and I feel like I never knew her. I never saw her as a person. I never connected with her. She never listened to what I said. She never loved me. Guess what? Last year, her doctors finally decided to take her off of that medication. And for the first time ever, I am having real conversations with my mother. She looks at me when I talk to her. She has 30-minute conversations with me on the phone where she listens quietly to me and then responds to me with a response. Like, I can't stress to you enough. She used to never listen to what I said or cared about what I said or my feelings. And I hate to say it, but it's definitely due to that medication that they had her on. Instead of treating her mental illnesses the way that they should have, with therapy, with going deep down and figuring out why the way she is the way she is, why she is the way she is, they just put her on drugs and send her home because that's often what they want to. It's the easy way out and it's a way for them to make money. So I do not approve. I'm sorry. Also, I have my own story with prescription medications and they really made me a lot worse, I have to say. If you guys want me to make a full video about that, I will. Let me know in the comments. In my job, I was confronted on an almost daily basis with issues I thought I had left behind at the VA. My experience with combat veterans had so sensitized me to the impact of trauma that I now listened with a very different ear when depressed and anxious patients told me stories of molestation and family violence. I was particularly struck by how many female patients spoke of being sexually abused as children. This was puzzling, as the standard textbook of psychiatry at the time stated that incest was extremely rare in the United States, occurring about once in every 1,000,000 women. I can say that's probably why so many women were shamed into not talking about it, especially in the past. Given that there were then only about 100 million women living in the United States, I wondered how 47, almost half of them, had found their way to my office in the basement of the hospital. Furthermore, the textbook said there is little agreement about the role of father-daughter incest as a source of serious subsequent psychopathology. So, something like this did happen to me as a child, but it wasn't either of my parents. So that's why this isn't too hard to read. My patients with incest histories were hardly free of subsequent psychopathology. They were profoundly depressed, confused, and often engaged in bizarrely self-harmful behaviors, such as cutting themselves with razor blades. That reminds me, I thought about this before filming. My cat got me here on my wrist and on my hand today. That one's really fresh. But I was going to tell you guys before starting filming that this isn't me harming myself, I swear. I haven't done that since 4th grade. Okay, I'm gonna move on. The textbook went on to practically endorse incest, explaining that such incestuous activity diminishes the subject's chance of psychosis and allows for a better adjustment to the external world. In fact, as it turned out, incest had devastating effects on women's well-being, which it does. If you questioned that, you shouldn't anymore. In many ways, these patients were not so different from the veterans I had just left behind at the VA. They also had nightmares and flashbacks. They also alternated between occasional bouts of explosive rage and long periods of being emotionally shut down. Most of them had great difficulty getting along with other people and had trouble maintaining meaningful relationships. This is one thing that has been really on my mind lately is all of these veterans, they end up with wives and children and stuff. Whereas me and women like me with severe PTSD from childhood, why do I get nothing? I almost feel like I'll never have anything that helps me be happier in life, and that's really scary to think about. And I know it's definitely possible and I may get it, but I'm just I haven't been feeling good about myself lately, and I've been very lonely, and it's been very hard dealing with all the stuff I'm dealing with by myself. And I've just been questioning, why me? Why do I get so unlucky? Why do all these other, mean women out there get to have a loving relationship? I don't know. Loving relationships can help people get so much better, and it really sucks to feel like I am worthless in many ways, because I have been treated like that by many men because of my mental illness. So, okay, I'm just gonna keep reading. As we know now, war is not the only calamity that leaves human lives in ruins. While about a quarter of soldiers who serve in war zones are expected to develop serious post-traumatic problems, the majority of Americans experience a violent crime at some point during their lives, and more accurate reporting has revealed that 12 million women in the United States have been victims of rape. More than half of all rapes occur in girls below age 15. For many people, the war begins at home. Each year, about 3 million children in the United States are reported as victims of child abuse and neglect. 1 million of these cases are serious and credible enough to force local child protective services or the courts to take action. In other words, for every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their own homes. This is particularly tragic, since it is very difficult for growing children to recover when the source of terror and pain is not enemy combatants, but their own caretakers. This last part is very short. It's the end of the chapter. It's called A New Understanding. It's only 3 paragraphs. We're almost there. In the 3 decades since I met Tom, we have learned an enormous amount about not only the impact and manifestations of trauma, but also about ways to help traumatized people find their way back. Since the early 1990s, brain imaging tools have started to show us what actually happens inside the brains of traumatized people. One day I'll have a brain scan video on my channel, you guys. That'll be very interesting. Whew. I tried to get hypnotized once, you guys. That was so weird. Basically, long story short, the hypnotist told me that he was not going to be able to hypnotize me because my brain worked way too differently than anything he has ever seen before. I'll probably make a video about that because that was a super interesting day for me. I thought I was going to get hypnotized, and I walked out of there having just educated the hypnotist about my mental disability and why my brain was so different, and him being like so intrigued listening to me the whole time, and I was like shocked because I'm not used to people being interested in that part of me. Yeah, it was really cool. And also sad. And another way of making me feel like not a part of society and like a fucking alien who just can't do anything normal, even get hypnotized. Great. Cool. Okay. This has proven essential to understanding the damage inflicted by trauma and has guided us to formulate entirely new avenues of repair. We have also begun to understand how overwhelming experiences affect our innermost sensations and our relationship to our physical reality, the core of who we are. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past, it is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. If you've ever tried to be my friend, I'm so sorry. It's so hard living like this with how my brain works, and I feel like all I've ever done is like confuse or scare people away from me. And this is precisely why. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. Okay? Like, really, really process that for a second, because it's true and it's crazy. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it is not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the processes in which it heals. That is the end of chapter 1. I got to page 21. So, part 1 was pages 1 through 12. Part 2 was pages 13 through 21. Thank you so much for watching this and sticking around. I know this is very hard to listen to, but I really, really appreciate you educating yourself about this. Seriously, like, I've gotten to the point of telling customers at my work to watch these videos because it is hard enough for me to work a full-time job. It is also hard enough for me to try and act like I'm okay the entire time. So, yeah. I may not look like I struggle with severe PTSD and like I sweat profusely all the time when I have flashbacks and panic attacks and people trigger me on the daily, but I do. And that's who I am. And that's who a lot of people are. And the only way to help people like me get better is to accept them and try your best to understand them better instead of just invalidating them. Seriously, just try. I know it's hard with some of us. I know. But we all go through stages of being really, really bad. And then we'll come out of it. Maybe then you can try to help them as best you can. But often when we're in our worst states, it's hard to talk to anybody, even the people closest to us who love us the most. So keep that in mind. It is not personal. Okay, I recommend going and watching my 11 tips on supporting a partner with mental illness video. This gives you so many great helpful tips. So please go and watch that video. I'm only making this to help people because I have been through hell my whole life having mental illness and seeing other people go through it too and be bullied for it. So That's not okay. Let's end bullying and let's start educating, okay? Whatever you're doing, have a good day, good night, good evening. Bye, guys.
For all your tragedies, all right, happy endings. Undo all our suffering. I missed you, my darling.
Bip, bop, boop. Okay. Should I make the lighting better? What do you think? Let's see. How's that? That's a little better. Now I think I need to take these off so you guys don't have too much glare bothering you. Okay. Tom kept showing. For years, I encountered a similar phenomenon in victims of child abuse. Physical sensations he had felt during the original event. No place to go, no goal to reach. Then, of course, sorry if you hear my tummy growling, in the treatment of schizophrenics, of